There are lots of different perspectives on motivation. We can start with things like neuroscience, where there are people who are doing brain scans and trying to figure out what motivates a human being to take an action. On the flip side, we have people like myself, addiction psychiatrists, who are sitting in rooms with people who are struggling to overcome a substance. But you can also go to other fields like advertising, where people are trying to figure out what motivates someone to spend money. Or you can even look at global macro trends through things like behavioral economics, where economists are trying to figure out what causes the stock market to move in one direction or another direction. So there are so many different perspectives, and we can't forget the self-help gurus and the YouTube gurus who are offering all these different tips and tricks on motivation. So how are we going to approach this aspect of motivation? What truly is motivation? So the first thing that I kind of want to comment on is that motivation is an emergent property. It's not actually a discrete thing. And this is why it's so hard to pin down and create, because motivation is sort of what happens, what arises out of a lot of other factors. And there's a really interesting clue in this. So when I was studying to become a monk in India, I was really curious about motivation. I know that in my life, I couldn't bring myself to do things that were important to me. So when I went to India and I discovered this whole, library of literature on the human mind and how it works, I was stunned to discover that I could not find a single book on motivation. And as I asked my teachers about it, I asked them, where are the books on motivation? And they actually told me something really shocking. There is no Sanskrit word for motivation. It doesn't exist. And this was so surprising because Sanskrit is such a sophisticated language when it comes to the mind. In the way that some cultures have 100 words for snow, Sanskrit has 100 words for different fluctuations of the mind. There are several different states of consciousness, and even the word desire can be broken down into all of these different variations. So I was kind of confused about, why doesn't Sanskrit have a word for motivation? And it turns out that this concept of motivation actually involves a bunch of different pieces. That motivation is an emergent property. It's something that kind of rises out of a lot of different functions of the mind. So if you look at someone and you think of that person as motivated, if you go and talk to that person, you ask them, where does your motivation come from, or how did you get motivated? They're just going to kind of shrug their shoulders. And they're like, yeah, I don't really know. I just kind of decided one day that I was going to do this thing. And so then you're kind of scratching your head and they're like, well, how did they decide that? How does that work? What are the components of motivation? Is it an emotion? Is it logic? Is it ego or identity? What's going on here? And so our approach to understanding motivation is going to be a little bit more oriented towards Sanskrit. So what we're going to have to do is some traditional HG kind of stuff. The first thing that we're going to have to do is understand that motivation is individualized. That despite all of the science that we have, no scientific paper is going to perfectly explain to you how you work. We can understand principles of neuroscience and principles of psychology, but which of those principles apply to you? So what we're going to share today is a lot of different information, but each piece of that information may not apply to you. So I encourage you to take a personalized approach and see what resonates with you and sort of set aside that which doesn't fit. The second thing that we're really going to have to do is understand something before we fix it. So this module will definitely have solutions, but I think half the problem with the world today is that everyone is offering motivational solutions without motivational diagnoses. So in medicine, we have a saying that good diagnosis precedes good treatment. You can't fix a problem unless you understand it. And it's not just a medical thing. If I have a clogged toilet, the first thing that the plumber does is figures out, why is this clogged? Where is the blockage? And in terms of unlocking our own motivation, we need to do the exact same thing. So the way that we're going to approach this is understand that what we call motivation has three discrete components. And by optimizing these three discrete components, we'll sort of increase our chances of actually acting. The first component is intent. And so there may be certain goals that we have in life, but we never really tunnel down into why is this actually a goal for me? Because half the reason that we don't do what we're quote unquote supposed to do is because we actually don't care about it, right? I should eat healthier. I should exercise every day. I should study harder. I should wake up at 5 a.m. every single day. I should, even in my case, when I was growing up, become a doctor. So we can have all kinds of goals, all kinds of things that we should do, but if the goal comes from outside of us, which is oftentimes what we'll discover, then chances are it's going to be very hard to get motivated towards it. So we're going to dive into the concept of intent. What goes into the intent of a goal? And by sort of optimizing our intent, by doing some kind of introspective work, what we can really do is build up a very powerful why that helps us move forward. The next thing that we're going to dive into is resistance. Because even if I decide for myself that, okay, this is a really, really important goal, I've discarded all of my sort of conditioned goals or all the things that my parents want me to do or all the things that society tells me to do, and this is really what I want to do. After we go through that process, when you wake up the next day, it's not like it happens like that. Even if I really, really want to do something and there's something very genuine driving me forward, I can sometimes run into a problem. The simplest way to understand this is I can have 1,000 good reasons to do something and I can really want to do something, but I just can't bring myself to do it. So where is that blockage coming from? Why can't I bring myself to do it? That's when we're going to dive into resistance. And resistance comes from two major places. The first is emotions. And this is where it's really important to understand that the goals that we have are usually logical in nature, right? I should do this because it's a good idea. It's incredibly logic. Of course I should get an A. Why would anyone want a B instead of an A? Of course I want an A. But when I strive for getting an A, when I try to get an A, what I discover is some kind of resistance. Another example of this is someone who feels very, very lonely, but can't bring themselves to ever engage with people socially. So of course I'm lonely. I want more than anything else a romantic partner. I want to live my life with someone that we can sort of bind our lives together and grow old together. And yet I'm paralyzed when it comes to going on a date. I can never ask anyone out. And I'm terrified at the idea of being set up by my friends. So what's going on there? It turns out that even if I really want something and that want is genuine, some kind of emotional blockage can exist that prevents me from actually moving forward. The second source of resistance is actually our sense of identity, or our ahamkar. And as we sort of touch on neuroscience and things like that, we'll even discover some really, really interesting things. So if I view myself as lazy, if I think of myself as a failure, what does that mean for my chances of success? Because the truth of the matter is, through a lot of psychological and neuroscientific principles, our sense of identity can actually hamstring us. Our sense of identity can actually hold us back. Because think about this for a second. Our brain doesn't do things that it thinks will fail, right? We only engage in tasks that we think are actually going to be successful. But if I view myself as a failure, what does that do to the possibility of success? The success is going to be really low, right? Because I'm a failure. And if the chance of success is low, how does that affect my motivation? It decreases my motivation. So oddly enough, here we are trying to motivate ourselves when actually what we need to do is let go of part of our identity. After exploring resistance, we're going to end up with actual action. And so at the end of the day, we can focus on sort of the why we want to behave in a particular way. We can also focus on the kinds of obstacles that get thrown up by our brain or our mind. But at the end of the day, when it comes to actually accomplishing stuff, there are some concrete techniques that we can use to make it easier for us to move forward. So for example, we have this part of our brain called the frontal lobes. And our frontal lobes are the part of our brain that plans and executes tasks. So if you think a little bit about, okay, I'm having a party tonight. Your brain, what it does is it takes that abstract task of having a party and thinks through all the things that have to happen. Okay, I need to take out the trash, I need to clean my apartment, I need to go get groceries, I need to get snacks, I need to go get dessert, I need to get candles because it's someone's birthday. So it takes this abstract task and it breaks it up into bite-sized pieces. So sometimes the reason that we struggle to move forward is because our brain doesn't know how to break up tasks. The goals that we set for ourselves are too abstract or too far in the future. And then our brain literally doesn't know how to get started. Because for a lot of us, the problem is getting started. Oh, I never realized that it would be this easy once I got started. The hardest step to take was the first step. So we'll teach you a lot of practical techniques about how to set good goals. What are the pitfalls that we run into when we try to set good goals? How do we actually operationalize tasks? We'll also teach you all kinds of other interesting tidbits, like how can you cultivate an environment that supports your motivation. We'll also teach you practical things like how to set healthy technology habits, because one of the biggest challenges that we run into now is I can have a really good reason, I can clarify my intent, I can overcome my resistance, and I can even plan out a really, really good task list for the day. But all of that is going to go out the window if I open up my phone and start scrolling. So at the end of the day, any kind of motivation has to be coupled in today's day and age with healthy technology hygiene. So in summation, our approach to motivation is going to be very multifactorial. It comes from the general idea that motivation is not something that you can increase. That motivation is actually an emergent property, kind of like flight. So if you look at a bird that's flying, where does the flight come from? Is it in the bones of the wing? Is it in the feathers of the wing? Is it in the muscles of the wing? Is it in the weight of the bird? Is it the height that it starts at? Is it the wind that's blowing? Where does flight come from? Flight is an emergent property that includes all of these different components. And the challenge is that when we try to motivate ourselves, when we try to just do stuff, all we're looking for is flight without understanding what are the elements of flight. And so the cool thing is that as we dig into each of these elements, as we understand each of these aspects, and you sort of figure out which of these things applies to me, is the reason I'm not motivated because my goals are essentially internalized from parental expectations? Well, no wonder you don't want to do it. Is the reason that you can't act because you're actually ashamed of yourself or you're afraid of looking like an idiot? Well, that comes from your ego. Well, no wonder you can't act. Or is the reason that you struggle to act because your goal is so damn abstract that your brain doesn't even know where to start? Oh, what do I want to do in life? I need to find a purpose. Well, think about that for a second. How is your brain supposed to know, what do you do with that? Where do you start? Is it in reading a book? Is it a fiction book or a nonfiction book? Do you go to a monastery and spend a month? Or do you have a heart-to-heart conversation with your grandfather? Do you talk to strangers on the internet or do you go see a therapist? Where do you even start? So hopefully, if we understand each of these individual things, and as we unpack all of the different elements of motivation, you'll sort of figure out what works for you. And as you figure out what works for you, hopefully you'll be able to actually do stuff.